Hello, listeners. This is Kat. Welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfics. This will be the continuation of All For You. This will be Part 14, Day 29. Day 29, 30 weeks. You know, Reiki-san said, and Hisashi hummed, looking up at her from where he'd been watching his son look around. Izuku couldn't exactly sleep during Reiki-san's assessment, so he was taking advantage of the time to observe his surroundings and attempt to push away the mask that Reiki-san was trying to put back on his little face. He was handling the transition from ventilator to CPAP well, but that didn't mean he liked the masks. Still, they couldn't cut corners. He still needed the support, and part of that meant he had to be checked frequently, despite his protests. Hisashi knew that he would be quick to fall back asleep as soon as he was able, though. The doctor shot him a small smile as she finished up. He's healthy enough at this point that you can start getting involved in his care. Oh, Hisashi said, sitting up straighter, a grin growing on his face. That's wonderful. He clasped his hands together, looking back down at Izuku. Izuku stared at the bouncing green line of his heart monitor. He was doing so well, but he's still so small. Should I really? Hisashi said, his voice trailing off uncertainly. All For One was not one to be uncertain. He moved and decided and fought with no second guesses, confident in his power and superiority. There were moments when he had to play cautiously, of course, bide his time until he could spot a weakness or an opening, but he was still a god at playing games among men. This, however, was no game. There would be real, devastating consequences should he act confident when he was not, and Hisashi had little confidence when it came to being gentle. Do you want to? Reiki-san asked. Hisashi looked up at her again, blinking. Of course. Well then, come on, Reiki-san said, stepping aside to make room for him on the other side of the incubator. He needs to be shifted onto his side. You can do that. Hisashi's lips thinned as he fiddled with the sleeves of his jacket. It wasn't his suit jacket. He normally took it off after the meetings, since it was the only clean one he had currently. It was just some athletic jacket. Tugging on fabric was far less familiar than adjusting cufflinks, and fidgeting nervously in general was deeply unfamiliar territory. But he couldn't help it. His hands were not kind hands. They ruined lives. They spilled blood. They manipulated innocence. They did not know how to handle tiny, fragile babies who could die if the wrong butterfly flapped its wings. Isn't it a bit early for me to do anything of that sort? Hisashi asked, staying seated. She shook her head, smiling a little at him. You've let him hold your finger loads of times, and you've done hand hugs. This is just like that, just another step. Baby steps, right? Hisashi hummed noncommittally, looking at Izuku. His eyes had drifted shut at some point during their conversation. His limbs moved slowly as he wiggled in place, caught in the limbo between wakefulness and slumber. He tried to imagine picking him up, but he couldn't. All he could imagine was accidentally hurting him. Preemies are a lot less fragile than people give them credit for, Reiki-san pointed out. He's not going to crumble into dust if you touch him wrong, and I'll be here to guide you along anyway. Hisashi had a quirk that did that, but he kept his mouth shut. That particular fact wasn't helpful in this scenario. If you're not ready, you can wait. He didn't want to wait. He wanted to wait. He wanted to hold his baby. No, Hisashi said, pushing himself to his feet and walking over. I can try. She stopped speaking, looking at him curiously. Of course. I'll walk you through it, okay? Your hands clean? Hisashi said. Not yet. He quickly slipped away, to the bathroom, mentally berating himself for getting too eager. He washed his hands and walked back over before he could lose his courage. Reiki-san opened the portholes to the incubator and gestured for him to put his hands in. Hisashi swallowed. He'd done this plenty of times before, to let Izuku hold his finger or do a hand hug before care. Yet somehow this felt far more weighty. He took a deep breath, put his hands in, letting them curl into fists next to Izuku's body. His fist was the size of Izuku's entire ribcage, maybe larger. Izuku's hand rested on the blankets near his. Even with his finger spread, his hand was utterly tiny, so small that Izuku had never been able to wrap his hand entirely around Hisashi's fingertip. Hisashi knew this. He knew how small his son was. He'd only spent the last month staring at him every moment he could. Izuku had grown and gained weight during that time, to the point where he was finally starting to look like an actual baby and not a little old man, but he was still incredibly small. But there was something very different between seeing an infant that small and being faced with the prospect of picking up an infant that small. Izuku was so much smaller than Yoichi had been when he was a baby, and Hisashi was so much larger than he had been back then too. Even when he had been safely seated on the ratty, dirty sofa, and his mother had just placed Yoichi in his small, 5-year-old lap, he'd been scared. Hisashi's stomach dropped, and he swallowed hard. Now he was terrified. "All right, since he fell asleep, we're going to have to wake him up again. Give him a hug, like usual, then tell him you're going to move him," Reiki-san said. Hisashi nodded, clenching his fist once to dispel the faint unsteadiness that had started to manifest. He placed a hand on Izuku's head and let the other cup Izuku's feet and legs, taking care to avoid all the wires and IVs on his chest. "Ugh," Izuku said, his arms twitching. He didn't sound happy about being woken up. Hisashi swallowed again. "Hello, Izuku," he whispered. "I'm going to put you on your side now, okay?" Izuku became a little calmer as he spoke, but he still didn't seem particularly enthused. "Reiki-san," Hisashi said, staring at Izuku as he felt tiny feet push against his palm. "He doesn't seem very happy." Reiki-san hummed next to him. "Well, of course not. He just got woken up. Nobody's happy when they get woken up from a good sleep. We still need to move him, though. If he stays in the same position too long, his head's going to start to flatten out." "Ah," Hisashi said faintly. "Don't worry. He'll go right back to sleep once you get him in position. You good to keep going?" Reiki-san asked. "No," he wanted to say. "Yes," he said. "All right, so next you're gonna get your hands under him, one under his head and shoulders and one under his bottom," Reiki-san said. "Put your hand under his little butt," he thought, with a slight edge of panic. The thought had sounded like Mitsuki. Slowly, carefully, Hisashi pulled his hands away from Izuku. His hand squirmed in place, one leg kicking out. Hisashi sucked in a deep breath and let it out slowly, starting to work his fingers under Izuku. The unsteadiness was back, even worse than before. Izuku whined, his arms flailed, hands splayed in what looked like a stop signal. Izuku needed a break. He did too. Hisashi pulled his hands away quickly, curling them back into his fists to hide how much they were shaking. His jaw worked as he stared at Izuku, watching him calm down a little. "Pardon," he murmured, and Reiki-san hummed non-judgmentally beside him. He glared at his hands. This was not the time to lose his composure. His hands needed to be strong and steady to make sure Izuku was as safe as possible while Hisashi was handling him. If he could not keep his hands from shaking, then... He dug into his quirk stockpile. Even if he lacked the quirks to help Izuku directly, there had to be something there. A steady hand quirk. He'd stolen it from an artist nearly a century ago, out of spite, even though he had no real purpose or desire for it, at least not until now. Hisashi immediately turned it on and let out a soft sigh as his hands finally steadied. Izuku had calmed. He could try again. Hisashi took a deep breath and let it out slowly. If he couldn't do it this time, he was just letting Reiki-san do it. Izuku's safety and comfort wasn't worth his pride. He started working his fingers delicately under Izuku's head and bum again. Izuku whined, his arms moving erratically. Hisashi hesitated. "He's fine, you're doing good," Reiki-san said beside him. Hisashi nodded and pushed on until, finally, Izuku's head, shoulders, and bottom rested in his palms. Barely breathing, Hisashi lifted Izuku up. He was holding Izuku. Kind of. Izuku wasn't cradled against his chest. He was lying in his palms, but he was holding Izuku. It felt like he was holding nothing at all. It felt like he was holding the entire world. Izuku's eye peeked open as he wriggled in Hisashi's hands, his movements no longer erratic. A grin burst across his face. "Hello," he whispered. Izuku blinked and looked away. Hisashi tried not to feel hurt. He was probably getting overwhelmed. He needed to put Izuku on his side and let him go back to sleep. Once that was done, he could revel in the fact that he'd held his baby. Glacially, he lay Izuku back down on his side and worked his hands back out from under him. He grabbed Inko's blanket and pulled it over Izuku up to his little shoulder. Izuku pulled his arm out. Hisashi huffed and gently tucked Izuku's arm back under the blanket. Izuku let out a tiny whine and pulled his arm back out again. "Come now, Izuku," Hisashi said, trying again. "Don't you want to stay tucked in?" Like clockwork, Izuku's arm popped back out again, with another, louder whine, his hand waving in the air. "I think the answer is no," Reiki-san said dryly. All right, I'll let you have it your way," Hisashi sighed, taking his hands out of the incubator. Stubborn boy. Wonder where he got that from, Reiki-san said, eyeing him. His mother, Hisashi said. Reiki-san rolled her eyes, then looked at Izuku with a critical eye. She reached in to adjust Izuku's blankets, pillows, and positioning slightly. Then she pulled her hands back out and nodded. The occupational therapist may come in and adjust him. Hisashi nodded. He was inexperienced. That only made sense. But good job, she added with a small smile. His grin grew. After Reiki-san left, Hisashi sat down in his usual chair and offered his finger to Izuku, who nudged his hand, which was still moving around quite a bit ever so gently. Izuku immediately grabbed on, his movements calming down as he quickly fell asleep. Hisashi felt like his chest was going to burst. Was it possible to care for someone else this much? Before, he would have said no. But maybe he had been wrong. Ring, 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 ring. Hello, this is Inko Midoriya. I'm sorry I missed your call. Please leave a message and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Beep. Inko, darling, I have wonderful news. I got to hold Izuku today. Well, sort of. I was not cradling him. Izuku's not ready for that yet, nor is he ready to do this, kangaroo care thing the doctors have been saying would be good for him. All I was really doing was shifting his position, which I'll admit sounds a lot less nerve-wracking than it actually felt. He's still so small, Inko. Regardless, he was in my hands, and I was the only thing holding him up against the pull of gravity, so I would say it counts, at the very least, as a partial hold. Sanuki-san has been saying that he might be ready to leave the incubator for an extended period of time soon, so I'm hopeful I'll be able to hold him properly in the near future. A pause. A sigh. I wish you could be here, Inko. I'm sure you'd be better at all this than I am. I miss you, and I'm sure Izuku does too. Call ended. Hisashi peered at Izuku out of the corner of his eye. He was waiting. Izuku had fallen asleep a while ago and released his finger not long after. While he was waiting for Izuku to fall asleep, a light slumber was not good enough. No, for this particular mission, Izuku needed to be well and truly asleep. Which it finally seemed like he was. His son lay still amongst his blankets and pillows, chest rising and falling peacefully, his little arm still resting above the soft fabric of his blankets. Now was the time to strike. Hisashi stood up and washed his hands and then crept back silently to crouch next to the incubator. Slowly, he opened 2 portholes in the incubator and reached in with both hands, as delicately as humanly possible. Hisashi picked up Izuku's arm with 2 fingers, lifted up his blanket, and tucked his arm underneath. Hisashi removed his hands, closed the incubator back up, and stood. He smirked to himself as he sat in his chair once again. Baby successfully tucked in. All right, listeners. This concludes day 29 of All For You. Hope you all are enjoying this still. I love the fighting, basically, between Hisashi and Izuku with him not wanting to be tucked in. That always cracks me up when I read this fic. Let me know your overall thoughts and reactions to everything so far, and as always, thank you so much for listening.